3 weeks ago, gun owners across the country thought they had finally caught a break. For the first time in nearly a century, the National Firearms Act tax was gone. No $200 payment to the federal government. No artificial barrier designed in 1934 to price regular Americans out of exercising a constitutional right. Suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and other NFA items were finally being treated like normal firearms transactions. And people moved fast. Dealers saw record traffic. Manufacturers ramped up production. ATF e-forms were flooded with Form 1 and Form 4 submissions. Tens of thousands of Americans filed paperwork in good faith, believing the rules had changed and that the government would honor them. But now, that window may be slamming shut, violently, because buried inside Congress right now is a proposal that doesn't just bring the NFA tax back, it supercharges it, multiplies it, weaponizes it. A $4,709 tax per NFA item, per suppressor, per short-barreled rifle, per transfer, per build. And if this passes, suppressors and SBRs won't just become expensive, they'll become unaffordable by design. This isn't about safety, it isn't about crime, and it definitely isn't about compromise. It's about pricing people out. The proposal rewrites Section 5811 of the Internal Revenue Code, the section that governs how NFA items are taxed. For decades, that number was $200, a figure chosen in 1934 not because it made sense, but because it hurt. Back then, $200 was the equivalent of several months' wages. The tax often cost as much as the firearm itself. That was the point. Lawmakers knew they couldn't outright ban certain firearms, so they used taxation as a workaround. Now, the same playbook is being reused, just updated for modern economics. The $4,709 figure isn't random. It's calculated by taking the original 1934 tax and adjusting it for inflation. Supporters of the proposal claim this simply restores the tax to its original intent. But that's exactly the problem. And when you apply that logic to today's market, the results are devastating. A suppressor that currently costs $600, with a $4,709 tax, you're looking at over $5,300 before dealer fees, before sales tax, before accessories. That's not regulation, that's elimination. Timing matters, and this timing is not accidental. Since January 1st, when the NFA tax dropped to zero, the ATF has been overwhelmed with applications. Industry estimates suggest over 100,000 Form 1 and Form 4 submissions were filed in just the first 2 weeks. These aren't hypothetical buyers. These are real people who already paid for their items, who already submitted fingerprints, who already cleared background checks, who are now waiting, sometimes for months, for government approval. That waiting period is the trap. Because if the law changes before approvals are finalized, the government could demand the new tax before releasing the item. You filed when the tax was zero, but if approval comes after the rule change, you may be forced to pay nearly $5,000 or walk away. And if you walk away, you don't get your time back. You don't get your filing fees back. In many cases, you don't even get your purchase refunded. That's leverage, and it's powerful. Supporters of the proposal will say the same thing they've always said. It's not a ban, it's just a tax. But let's be honest about what this actually does. The median household income in the United States is around $75,000. A $4,709 tax represents over 6% of an entire year's income, just to exercise a single right, one time. That's more than many Americans spend on groceries in a year, more than a semester of college at some community schools, more than most emergency funds. And that's before you even buy the item. A right that only exists for people who can afford a $5,000 entry fee isn't a right. It's a privilege reserved for the wealthy. That was unconstitutional in 1934, and it's unconstitutional now. This tax doesn't stop with consumers. Manufacturers would also be hit hard. The proposal raises the manufacturing tax on suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and short-barreled shotguns from $0 to $555 per unit. For machine guns and destructive devices, manufacturers would pay the full $4,709 per item produced. That cost doesn't disappear, it gets passed down the line. Manufacturers raise prices to survive. Dealers raise prices to cover inventory. Consumers pay the difference, or they're shut out entirely. Small manufacturers, especially suppressor companies producing a few thousand units per year, would be crushed. Many operate on margins under 20%. A per-unit tax alone could exceed their annual profit. The result? Consolidation. Small companies fold. Innovation dies. Only large corporations with massive capital reserves remain. Easier to regulate, easier to pressure, easier to control. And that's not a side effect, that's a feature. What makes this proposal dangerous isn't just the number, it's the precedent. If Congress can tax the Second Amendment at $4,709 per use, what stops them from doing the same to other rights? A $5,000 fee to publish a newspaper, a permit tax for public assembly, a licensing cost to speak online. Supporters will laugh this off. They'll say it's different, that guns are unique, but history shows otherwise. Once a government proves it can price people out of a right without calling it a ban, that tool doesn't stay limited to one amendment. And that's why this matters. Even if you don't own a suppressor, even if you've never touched an SBR, even if you don't own a firearm at all, because this isn't just a tax, it's a test. To understand why this $4,709 NFA tax is so dangerous, you have to look beyond Congress and into the machinery that actually controls who gets approved and when. That machinery is the ATF. And right now, it's jammed. When the NFA tax dropped to zero on January 1st, Americans did exactly what you'd expect them to do. They acted. Form 1 submissions, applications to manufacture NFA items like short-barreled rifles or suppressors, surged. Form 4 submissions, transfers from dealers to individuals, exploded. Industry insiders estimate that over 100,000 applications were submitted in the first 2 weeks alone. Some estimates go even higher. Either way, it's an unprecedented volume that instantly overwhelmed the ATF's NFA division. Here's the problem. The ATF has roughly 35 examiners responsible for processing every Form 1 and Form 4 in the entire country. Do the math. That's nearly 3,000 applications per examiner sitting in a digital queue right now. Even under unrealistically optimistic conditions, say an examiner processes 20 applications per day, it would still take more than 7 months to clear the existing backlog, and that assumes 0 new applications come in during that time, which is impossible. In reality, many applicants are looking at 9 months, a year, or longer. And that delay creates the perfect pressure point. If your application were already approved, this proposal would be inconvenient but survivable, painful but not retroactive. But if your application is pending, you're exposed, because NFA approvals aren't finalized until the moment the ATF stamps them approved. If the law changes before that moment, the ATF could argue that the new tax applies, regardless of when you filed. You did everything right. You followed the rules. You filed under a $0 tax, but the government controls the clock. And when the government controls timing, it controls outcomes. Applicants could be forced into an impossible choice: pay nearly $5,000 per item they never budgeted for, or abandon the application and lose months of time, fees, and in some cases, the firearm itself. That's not a hypothetical. It's how administrative law works. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the ATF is how much discretion it has. The agency can expedite certain applications, slow walk others, pause processing entirely under the justification of regulatory uncertainty. And that's been done before. During previous administrations, NFA processing times stretched beyond 12 months, not because of technical issues, but because of policy priorities. If this $4,709 NFA tax proposal gains momentum, the ATF could simply stop approving forms altogether, claiming they're waiting for clarity on what tax amount to collect. That would freeze tens of thousands of Americans in limbo, unable to take possession, unable to withdraw without loss, unable to move forward at all. When a government agency can trap you between two bad outcomes, it doesn't need enforcement raids. The pressure does the work. This tax becomes even more dangerous when paired with how the ATF defines what counts as an NFA item. The National Firearms Act covers 7 categories, but over the years, those categories have quietly expanded through administrative interpretation rather than legislation. The most obvious example is the pistol brace rule. For nearly a decade, the ATF said attaching a stabilizing brace to an AR-style pistol did not make it a short-barreled rifle. Millions of Americans relied on that guidance. Then, in 2023, the ATF reversed course. Suddenly, millions of legally owned firearms were reclassified as NFA items. Owners were given a temporary amnesty window to register without paying the $200 tax, but only because the agency knew the backlash would be enormous. Now imagine that same reclassification happening under a $4,709 tax. No amnesty, no free registration, just a massive bill, or felony charges. This is where things get truly alarming. There are an estimated 20 to 24 million AR-15 style firearms in civilian hands in the United States. A significant portion of them are configured as pistols, barrels under 16 inches, no stock, legally owned under current rules. Their legality hinges on definitions like designed to be fired from the shoulder, and those definitions are not set in stone. They're interpretations. If the ATF decides that certain AR pistols, based on weight, length, accessories, or configuration, are intended to be shouldered, they could be reclassified as short-barreled rifles overnight. That would instantly convert millions of Americans into owners of unregistered NFA items. Under a $4,709 tax, an AR pistol owner who paid $800 for their firearm could suddenly owe nearly 6 times the original purchase price just to keep it legal. Failed to pay? That's up to 10 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. This isn't paranoia, it's precedent. The ATF has already shown it's willing to reinterpret pistol braces, bump stocks, machine gun definitions. Once the tax is high enough, compliance drops and enforcement becomes selective. What makes this strategy effective isn't mass arrests, it's fear. When laws are complex, penalties are severe, and costs are extreme, people self-police. They avoid ownership altogether. They sell. They disengage. That's how rights disappear without headlines. No door kicks, no confiscation orders, just a maze of rules and fees that most people can't navigate or afford. And when you combine a massive tax with slow approvals and shifting definitions, you don't need to ban anything. You just wait. The people most at risk aren't future buyers, they're current applicants. They're the tens of thousands of Americans whose forms are sitting in the ATF's queue right now, waiting on examiners, background checks, and internal reviews. If the rules change while they wait, they pay the price, literally. And that's why this moment matters more than most people realize, because once the tax is back and once the precedent is set, rolling it back becomes almost impossible. Up to this point, we've talked about taxes, delays, reclassification, and administrative choke points. But there's one part of this proposal that has received almost no public attention, and it may be the most dangerous element of all: the expansion of what counts as a firearm. The language behind the $4,709 NFA tax doesn't clearly distinguish between a complete firearm and its component parts. That may sound like a technical detail. It's not. Under existing ATF interpretations, certain components are already treated as NFA items by themselves: suppressor tubes, suppressor baffles, end caps, machine gun conversion parts, short-barreled upper receivers in specific contexts. Even when they are not assembled into a functioning firearm, they can still trigger NFA regulation. Now, introduce a $4,709 tax into that framework. If the ATF decides that certain components qualify as firearms manufactured or transferred under the NFA, the tax could apply per part, not just per finished item. A suppressor tube? $4,709. Replacement baffles? $4,709. A short AR-15 upper receiver? Potentially $4,709. And once again, intent matters less than interpretation. If you own an AR-15 rifle and purchase a barrel under 16 inches, the ATF could argue you've constructively possessed a short-barreled rifle, even if it's never assembled. That theory has been used before. Under a $4,709 tax regime, that argument becomes financially devastating. This doesn't just affect gun owners. It hits gunsmiths, hobbyists, and manufacturers who work with NFA-adjacent components every day. Let's talk numbers, real ones. The U.S. civilian suppressor market generates roughly $1.2 billion annually, spread across about 80 manufacturers. Most of those companies are small to mid-sized operations, producing between 500 and 10,000 units per year. These companies typically operate on 15 to 25% profit margins. That's not greed, that's survival. Take a manufacturer producing 2,000 suppressors annually at $600 each. That's $1.2 million in revenue. At a 20% margin, that's $240,000 in profit. Now, apply the proposed $555 manufacturing tax per suppressor. That company would owe $1.11 million in federal taxes, more than 4 times its annual profit. The math doesn't work. They can't absorb it, they can't pass it on without killing demand, they can't survive. So what happens? They close. And when small manufacturers disappear, only large corporations remain, companies with diversified product lines, massive capital reserves, and political leverage. This is how industries are consolidated through regulation. You don't ban small businesses, you regulate them into extinction. A fragmented industry is hard to control. An industry dominated by a handful of corporations? Much easier. Fewer companies means easier compliance enforcement, fewer voices pushing back, and more leverage through licensing and contracts. Once the market is consolidated, additional regulations can be layered with minimal resistance. And consumers pay the price, not just in dollars, but in choice, innovation, and access. This strategy has been used before in other industries. Firearms are not unique. They're just the next target. Or SBRs, or even firearms. It's about precedent. If Congress can impose a $4,709 tax on the exercise of a Second Amendment right, and courts allow it to stand, the door is open. Wide open. What stops lawmakers from applying this same logic elsewhere? A licensing fee to publish a newspaper, a tax to operate a website that discusses politics, a permit fee to attend a protest, a registration cost to practice law or provide legal defense. Supporters will say, that would never happen. But people said the same thing about pistol braces, about bump stocks, about redefining what constitutes a machine gun. Rights don't disappear all at once. They erode. One rule, one tax, one reinterpretation at a time. The NFA has existed since 1934. Courts have upheld it for decades, often deferring to Congress's taxing power. If a $4,709 tax survives legal challenges, it becomes a green light, not just for this Congress, but for every future Congress. And once a precedent is set, reversing it is extraordinarily difficult. You might be listening to this thinking, I don't own a suppressor. I don't plan to buy an SBR. This doesn't affect me. That's exactly how this strategy works. It targets a minority first. It sets a precedent quietly. Then it expands. The moment a government can price citizens out of exercising a constitutional right without calling it a ban, every right becomes negotiable. Affordable today, unaffordable tomorrow. This proposal may not pass this time, but that doesn't mean the danger is gone, because the blueprint now exists. The math has been tested, the language has been drafted, the strategy has been refined. All it takes is a different Congress, a different administration, a different political moment, and when that happens, this framework will be waiting. Once you accept that a right can be taxed into irrelevance, you've already lost it. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never assume that a single victory means the war is over, because rights that aren't actively defended don't disappear overnight. They fade quietly, legally, and permanently.